Okay, I told you. I mean, it's not boring, but there's not much going on really in the large intestine. My wife would totally disagree with that. So, major parts. There's cecum, this large sac over here. Oh, sorry about that. We'll see it right away. So cecum, this large sac. There's colon, and there's rectum with anus. It's called large intestine because it's wider. It is much shorter than small intestine, not really that much essential, but still plays an important role. Main function really, fecal formation. When we say absorption of water and electrolytes, let's not flatter ourselves. Most of the water and electrolyte absorption still happens in the small intestine. Sorry, that happens all the time. So, most of the electrolyte and water absorption happens in the small intestine. Large intestine squeezes out the last drops and packs the undigested stuff into feces. We good? So this table briefly summarizes the functions of those intestinal parts. Cecum, the pouch. Okay. Here, can you see that? Really? Yeah, you kind of can. So this is ileocecal valve. So ileocecal valve controls the passage of chyme from small to large intestine. Remember we talked about gastrin actions? Gastrin opens ileocecal valve. So the chyme that was in the small intestine can now move on to the large. That makes sense. Absorbs electrolytes, but the most important function of the cecum is bacteria. I can talk about human commensal bacteria for probably a very long time. Let me give you an idea. At a given moment, you have about from 2 to 3 pounds of bacteria in your intestines. There are 10 times more cells, bacterial cells, in the intestines than the cells in the human body. Something about 100 trillion bacterial cells. There are 1,500 known species of bacteria in the intestine. Obviously, since it's not there, I'm doing the advertisement for bacteria now, like they need any. It is known that they are critical for digestive processes. Those of you who like sushi, our ability to digest seaweed depends entirely on bacteria. Human gut does not produce enzymes necessary for seaweed digestion. Bacteria can do that. It was demonstrated that diet changes bacterial composition. People who consume a lot of fiber in the diet not only fart more, they also have higher diversity of bacterial population. And it was shown that diversity, you understand what it means. More varieties. It was shown that higher bacterial diversity in the intestine is associated with like better outcomes, like less insulin resistance, let's say, okay? Less obesity. There's a strong correlation between the obesity or diabetes with bacterial populations in the intestine. It is not really clear in humans whether one causes another, whether like bacteria cause obesity, but there were some experiments showing that transplantation of microbiome between identical twins, you have a twin, there's I can only imagine to look for the pairs of identical twins. One of them is obese and another one is not. I think they searched practically the entire United States. They found like 5 pairs. That's it. Of identical twins that had considerable differences in body mass index. And they show that if you transplant the bacteria from normal weight to a obese one loses weight. So they do have effects. In mice, the mice is extremely convincing. Like you take bacteria from obese mice, put them in the normal mice become fat. You do the opposite, obese mice start to lose weight. Okay, so it's really, and the rate at which bacteria change is unbelievable. First of all, people who live on high carbohydrate diet, they have the same profile of intestinal microbes as do people who are obese. So you normal weight, but you eat a lot of carbs, you're going to have similar bacterial diversity as obese people have. You switch to high fat, high protein, low carb diet, like today, like Monday I start a new life, okay? And you ditch all the sugar, you ditch all the pies, and you start to eat like nuts, eggs, turkey, all that kind of stuff. Your bacterial populations will change tomorrow. 24 hours. It was shown multiple times in humans. It's amazing how fast they respond. They play an enormous role in inflammatory bowel disease. We have no idea which role they play, okay? But it was shown that they do. In mice, since now, plug for my lovely wife who works with mice that suffer from IBD-like illness. So, inflammatory bowel disease is the umbrella name for a number of conditions that involve pretty much everything from ileum, which just like duodenum, but just downstream and absorbs, okay? From ileum to cecum to large intestine, all large intestine, okay? So these mice are germ-free. They have sterile colon, no bacteria at all. It's kind of unbelievable, but you collect feces, put them on an agar plate, nothing grows out of them. I saw it, okay? Their feces do not smell. Period. Just no. No neutral. It's not pleasant. It's not neutral. Just no smell at all. Okay. Mice do not. Their cages do not smell because of that. It's pretty amazing. You know what else is amazing? When you open up, they develop colitis, colon inflammation spontaneously. Probably due to lack of bacterial colonization. Interesting thing. Well, think about this. So this is cecum, right? There's a bunch of bacteria in the cecum. You would assume you take bacteria out of the cecum, cecum will shrink. You open up germ-free mouse, their cecum is enormous. It's like 5 times bigger than it's horrible to look at how they can live with that. My wife said that they had situations when they looked at the male, pretty much they look at the mouse and say, is it pregnant? It cannot be pregnant, it's a male. It's not pregnancy. It's horribly enlarged cecum. Why? Mechanisms are not really known. So that's really an important part. Cecum is really important because that's where the most of bacteria are. Appendix here. A lot of lymphatic tissue. In general, in the large intestine, there's a lot of lymphatic tissue. Remember the word lamina propria? Mucosal layer? That's where mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue is. And it looks like presence of bacteria in the gut determines how our immune system develops. So basically, when we grow up, some of us grow up in cleaner environments than others. Depends on, parental preferences, and, you live on the farm, it's not going to be same level of cleanliness as if you live in the city, so on and so forth. It looks like, people who grow up in the farm tend to have less asthma and less allergies, probably because they have higher diversity of microbes in the guts. So it's real important. And appendix has a lot of immune tissue in it. At some point there was an idea to just remove appendices. Just, person is born, like, reach a certain age, let's just cut it out. For a couple of reasons, it's not really a good thing. First, you do the surgery, and second, maybe we need it for something. Then we talk about colon. Ascending, goes up, transverse, horizontal, descending, and sigmoid. Sigmoid is that last bent over part. Okay, on fecal formation and absorption of water and electrolytes. That's it. Anatomically, things that I want to focus, those are flexures. Right colic and left colic flexure. Colic refers to colon. You know how they say kids have colics? Okay? Because of the gas accumulation in the large intestine. Okay? That's colics. Now this is also called hepatic flexure because it's on the right. Look at this. I mean, this lady over there lost its liver, but you can see hepatic flexure. Hepatic flexure. And I will drop her. And the splenic flexure, because it's closer to the spleen. That makes sense? My mnemonic rule when I was a student, how to memorize where the liver and where the spleen. Liver has R in it, it's on the right. Spleen has only L in it, and it's on the left. Okay, I know, sucks, but helped me. Yeah, and then sigmoid colon ends up being rectum. I mean, it's not, it just goes into rectum. That's where feces accumulate. When feces accumulate in the rectum, rectum distends. That initiates the defecation reflex, which we're going to talk about. Basically, rectal valves is a structure that we should be very thankful for. Rectal valves allow humans to pass gas without defecation. So they keep heart and artery lead. In the anal canal, right here, you're going to find ridges and crevices. Ridges are called anal columns, and the crevices between them called anal sinuses. Anal columns and anal sinuses produce mucus, pretty thick mucus lubrication. Okay, when feces come out, so it's easier. Does that make sense? The epithelium, all the way to the anal canal, all the way to pretty much the pectinate line, is simple columnar, and at the pectinate line it changes to the stratified squamous. Does it make sense to you? Stratified squamous. Where is it? Remember? Abrasion forces? A lot of abrasion force right there. Does that make sense? Yeah, and defecation is controlled by two sphincters. And you will see this system both in defecation and urination. I'm sorry. The internal sphincter, internal anal sphincter, which you can see here, okay, is involuntary controlled. External is under the voluntary control. Does that make sense? So internal, think about this, when feces accumulate in the rectum stretches, that signal goes to the spinal cord, well, and to the cortex as well, because you know when it stretches, you know when it's time to go to the bathroom, right? Spinal cord sends the signal to the internal anal sphincter and relaxes it. Does that make sense? It doesn't mean that you're going to defecate right away, because external anal sphincter is controlled by cerebral cortex. So you need to send that signal down to the anus and relax external anal sphincter, and then the feces will come out. That makes sense. We'll talk about it. Okay. This is entirely anatomy. So two amenta. The greater amentum, which can be loosely seen here. By the way, this cadaver was pretty skinny. Greater amentum is pretty much the fatty apron that covers intestinal organs. People with abdominal obesity, accumulation of abdominal fat, greater amentum is where abdominal fat mostly accumulates. Does that make sense? I think we mentioned abdominal versus subcutaneous fat. So it's mostly in males. It's very characteristic for males, accumulation of abdominal fat. Lesser amentum holds together stomach and liver, and the mesocolons, the transverse mesocolon, mesentery that holds small intestine, and sigmoid mesocolon that holds parts of the large intestine. Basically, what you need to take home message from it: anatomy. Greater, lesser amentum, mesentery, transverse mesocolon, sigmoid mesocolon. Identify them. That's it. Mesentery is very rich in lymph nodes. A lot of lymph nodes. Because, a lot of pathogens that end up in the intestine, they will go through the intestinal wall, will end up in the lymphatic circulation. Okay, and that's the first point of surveillance by the immune system. Does that make sense? Any questions? I'm telling you, it's going to be fairly boring. Types of cells. Absorptive and goblet. So absorptive cells will absorb water and electrolytes. Goblet cells will produce mucus. Okay? Mucus is produced in the intestinal glands. A lot of mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So this is one of the follicles, the nodules of the lymphoid tissue. Okay, they do survey. If there is any type of microbial invasion, they will be the first ones to present this invasion to the immune system. That makes sense. Now, sort of a bigger anatomy of the large intestine. If you would look at this tube, ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, you can notice that, first of all, it's organized in separate sacs. That makes sense. Can you see them? This individual sacs. Each sac is called haustrum. Haustrum is singular, haustra is plural. They churn. The chyme that ends up in the large intestine is segmented, and each haustrum contracts rather independently and churns the chyme. That makes sense. Along the large intestine, you can see that band of a smooth muscle on this modulus. Right here you can see that pink band of the smooth muscle. This is called tinea coli. Tinea means worm, really. Okay? It's like colonic worm. The function of tinea coli to assist in the mass movements. Does that make sense? Remember we talked about mass movements. So mass movements are really powerful contractions of huge parts of the large intestine that propel the chyme, almost completely digested, whatever's left, towards the sigmoid colon and the rectum. So tinea coli just helps. It's an extra structure. Does that make sense? You may ask, wait, what about these little things that hang from tinea coli called amental or epiploic appendages? I do not ask about them. The thing is, we have no idea what they're for. They're like little, I don't know how to, just fat, just hanging. Just hanging. That's it. We don't know what's about it, really. They apparently have no function, just a feature. Okay? Any questions on the anatomy part? We good? Now, peristaltic control. This is the basic structure of the muscularis layer. Smooth muscle, nerve, well, the axon, and so-called interstitial cells of Cajal, named after, I think it was Spanish, Ramon y Cajal, the great physiologist, worked a lot of the neurotransmission. So here's what happens. Cells, smooth muscle cells in the intestinal wall, whether it's the large intestine or small intestine, they're connected by gap junctions. Can anyone remind me what gap junction is? What is gap junction? It's kind of self-explanatory, really. Gap. Yeah, it's a gap between two cells. Yeah, really. Seriously. Don't take it as a hole, like two holes. It's an ion channel that connects two cells. Okay? So, muscle cell, when it contracts, what happens to its membrane potential? Ooh, I'm getting into the forbidden territory. What happens to its membrane potential? Depolarizes, which means membrane potential becomes more positive, right? which means there are ionic changes. Am I clear? Ions say sodium flows into the cell. Got it? Which means if one cell is depolarized, if it's connected by the ion channel to another cell, what's going to happen to that another cell? It's going to depolarize. And another cell connected, also depolarize. This is called functional syncytium. Functional is kind of obvious, right? Syncytium. Cytium part refers to cells. Synchronous, together. So cells in the intestinal wall, the muscle cells, they contract all together. Does that make sense? Which is great. You don't have to stimulate each individual cell by individual nerve. You can just send an impulse to few of them, and it will be like a domino effect. All others will become depolarized. Are we clear about it? Good. Cardiac work the same way, yeah. Yeah, cardiac muscle works as a functional syncytium. Absolutely, yeah. And probably some separation. So, you know, when there's a signal, not the entire intestine like contracts all at the same time. There's some regulation. But essentially, if you need to contract million smooth muscle cells, you don't need to run 1 million axons. Does that make sense? Cool. If you will measure the membrane potential of the cells, either neurons or smooth muscle cells in the intestine, turns out they show slow waves. They don't get to the threshold to start action potential, but they get a little bit depolarized, repolarized, depolarized, repolarized. That makes sense. So they kind of have a tone, should I say, not like permanent tone, but they. So these slow waves are probably produced by these interstitial cells of Cajal. You can also call them pacemakers. Now, what's the point? There is a parasympathetic stimulation by a vagus nerve, or stretch and stimulation of the local receptors, local reflex. Does that make sense? The cell is closer to the threshold on the top of the slow wave, so it requires much less stimulus to get completely depolarized and get, into the action potential mode. Does that make sense? So some extra stretch, read heme in the intestine, will lead to the action potential. And action potential means contraction, muscle contraction. Does that make sense? That's the idea. Okay, you have slow waves. Okay, and then influx of positively charged ions, contraction, depolarization, contraction, and all of that. So what would stimulate? Stretch, first and foremost. And parasympathetics. Does that make sense? It's kind of... Ever heard about sludge syndrome? I love it. What produces sludge syndrome? Which toxin? Huh? Good. It's inhibitors of acetylcholinesterase, yes. So they will, or if you inhibit the destruction of ACH, or if you overstimulate the ACH receptors. Essentially, nerve gas or organophosphate pesticides will have this effect on a human. And in the acronym SLUDGE, which stands for salivation, lacrimation, urination, D stands for defecation, when massive inhibition of the enzyme that destroys acetylcholine leads to accumulation of acetylcholine in the parasympathetic neurons, in the synapses of parasympathetic system, overstimulation of parasympathetic system, and massive defecation. Does that make sense? That's parasympathetic or ACH. Okay. Now, when we squeeze the toothpaste under the tube, we kind of know that, you're supposed to go like one way. Right? And you know that, like, I hate it. At some point when you have the full tube and you just squeeze it like nonchalantly, randomly, the toothpaste becomes stuck in different parts of the tube. What I do, close the tube and I slide it at the angle of the counter. So I squeeze it all closer to the mouth of the tube. Now, in the stomach, we kind of we don't have someone who would just, squeeze the stomach content out, but essentially, peristaltic reflex is somewhat like it. And that's really elegant. So, this is the bolus of food present in the intestinal tube. Does that make sense? This is the proximal end. This is the distal end. Now, proximal end of the intestine closer to what organ? Stomach, and distal is closer to anus. So we gotta squeeze it towards distal end. Does that make sense? How do we do it? We relax the intestine at the distal end and squeeze it at the proximal. Before we move on, does that make sense? You kind of try to close it behind the bolus. Yeah, to not let it go backwards. Does that make sense? So, this is your bolus. It stretches the intestine. That stretch, together with chemoreceptors, will be sensed. I don't know if you can see it. I can barely see it. So this neurons with the like pink soma, can you see it? Pink soma. Those are sensory neurons. Right? So these sensory neurons will synapse the blue interneurons. It all happens in the local plexus. Okay. These blue, well, don't take it, they're not blue really. Okay, blue interneurons will produce the motor output and, synapse with the green motor neurons. Now, one reflex arch, will go kind of backwards, okay? We'll go upstream, closer to the proximal intestine, and will lead to depolarization and excitation and contraction of muscles. Another reflex arch will end up downstream at the distal end and will relax the muscles by hyperpolarizing them. Does that make sense? Got it? That's kind of synchronous. And it's really like two arches, and remember, reflex arches, sensory input, interneurons, motor output. This reflex, it's kind of simplified, but these arches work at the same time. One arch is stimulated and contracts. Another arch is stimulated and relaxes. Does that make sense? Please understand that idea. Now, what will be the stimuli for contraction? Contraction will be stimulated by substance P or ACH. Substance P is the large molecule neurotransmitter. It's stimulatory, it's pretty much exclusively stimulatory. In the CNS responsible for the pain sensation. And relaxation, nitric oxide, and vasoactive intestinal peptide, VIP. That makes sense. Now, to kind of sum up what I want you to know about the reflex. Flow of information through the reflex arch. So stretch or chemical stimuli will depolarize and lead to the contraction of the proximal part and will inhibit, relax, hyperpolarize the distal part. The neurotransmitter that will stimulate the muscles, that will contract them, will be acetylcholine and substance P, relaxation, nitric oxide, and vasoactive intestinal peptide. Am I clear? Any questions? Yeah, we kind of talked about it. It's reflex. Great example of autonomic reflex, right? So, I mean, it's kind of sort of both. Now, it has an autonomic part. Autonomic part, so the blue part, that's the sensory input. Stretch is sensed by the spinal cord, okay? And spinal cord produces the motor response to the muscles that surround rectum to push the feces out. Does that make sense? It also, this branch of reflex relaxes the internal anal sphincter. This is the one that we do not control. Do you know when the rectum is filled? Yes, you do. You have an urge to go to the restroom. If you like 1-year-old, you do not bother. Basically, you didn't learn how to control. So in kids up until about 2 years of age, this branch, the somatic part, it is not present yet. They have to learn. Does that make sense? So once they learn, then we can hold. Up until then, there's no way. I understand that flow, that's not really, I think, a big issue here. Make sense? Vomiting. Another example of the reflex, also pretty exciting. Usually caused by, so two reasons, okay? In very small children, remember how we talked about the esophageal sphincter? How it controls the passage of food from the esophagus to the stomach and doesn't let it go back. In kids, it's not really well controlled, so you can just flip the kid upside down and the kid will involuntarily refuse to accept food. It's not really going to be vomiting so much, okay? You just pretty much shake the food out of the kid. Now, vomiting is, first, distension. My mom still claims that when I was 5, I tried to follow steps of my brother, who's 11 years older, and I tried to eat as much as he did. And she said that it didn't end up well. I pretty much hyperextended my stomach. So yeah, I threw up in the end. Kind of the details that... Anyway, hyperextension. You overeat, basically. You really have to put some effort in it because you know when you fall. Okay, it's really hard to shove it. Irritation. Irritation stomach or intestine, mostly stomach or proximal small intestine, duodenum, jejunum, that's where it's going to happen. So what can be? Toxins, food poisoning, or alcohol. That's why people throw up when they consume alcohol. That's why sometimes if you drink really, really low quality alcohol, it's hard just to let it sink in, because that's the physiological response to get rid of it right away. Okay? Let's not touch why you ever do it, but sometimes it happens. It's really hard to keep it in. Or when you have to take a drug, like a liquid formulation, and it tastes terrible. Okay? It's physiological response, it's hard not to choke on it. Okay, does that make sense? Obstruction. So if there's an obstruction and pylorus, acidic vomitus, food doesn't go, essentially obstruction at the pylorus, obstruction right here, will keep the food in the stomach will get distended, vomiting. Obstruction in the duodenum, duodenal obstruction, or in the upper jejunum, will cause more of a neutral vomiting, and if it's obstructed in the jejunum, the vomiting will be violent. Okay? Really hardcore. And there will be bile involved probably. Obstruction, low obstruction will not cause vomiting because it's too far, but constipation most likely. Okay? Rarely vomiting. Am I clear? Now, the reflex is fairly straightforward. So you've got stomach, okay? You've got afferent fibers. Sympathetic, we'll get it to the spinal cord, vagal, to the medulla oblongata. In the medulla, there will be some chemicals produced. These chemicals will act on the efferent fibers and will stimulate the reverse peristalsis. Does that make sense? Essentially, vomiting is the reverse peristalsis. Now, since chemicals are involved here, the vomiting center in the medulla, there are antiemetic drugs. So emesis is vomiting. There are antiemetic drugs. There are drugs that inhibit vomiting center in the medulla and reduce vomiting urge. Motion sickness, interestingly enough, exact mechanism of motion sickness is still unclear, but most likely that due to miscoordination between the visual input and vestibular input, that same area of medulla is stimulated, like in case of vomiting reflex. The same chemicals are produced, the same neurons are stimulated, and people nauseate. Does that make sense? We're going to wrap it up at this point.